Welcome, everyone, to our latest bioethics grand rounds here at the Elson S. Floyd College of Medicine at Washington State University. Today, we have two very eminent speakers to talk about the concepts of ethics, informatics, and artificial intelligence in medical practice. Our second speaker will be Yoav Schlesinger, who is the director of the Office of Ethical and Humane Use of Artificial Intelligence and an architect of ethical AI practice in the Office of Ethical and Humane Use of Technology at Salesforce Corporation, where he helps the company embed and instantiate ethical production practices to maximize the societal benefits of artificial intelligence. Yoav is a graduate of Stanford University with degrees in religious studies and political science, and honors in international security studies. Our first speaker will be Elizabeth Worthey, who's an endowed associate professor at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and is director of the UAB School of Medicine Center for Computational Genomics and Data Science. She's also an associate director of the Hugh Cole Precision Medicine Institute, director of bioinformatics for the O'Neill Comprehensive Cancer Center, and director of bioinformatics for the UAB Pathology Molecular Diagnostic Lab, and director of UAB Genetics, Genomics, and Bioinformatics theme. I should say that Liz goes back quite a few years as a friend to our days in Wisconsin, and I can say that despite her many and numerous professional accomplishments, she's perhaps most famous for her Harry Potter themed Halloween parties. And so with that, I will introduce the two of them. I'll have the next slide, please. Our Bioethics Grand Rounds series is sponsored by the Certificate Program in Medical Ethics at Washington State University. This certificate is offered in collaboration with Kaiser Permanente Northern California Regional Ethics Program. For those who are interested in the certificate program, you can follow this link to more information about the certificate in medical ethics. Next slide, please. I also wanted to make folks aware that we are currently collecting stories for a special symposium issue of the journal Narrative Inquiry in Bioethics, where we are collecting stories, personal stories of people who have received clinical ethics consultation services as either a healthcare provider, a patient, a family member, or a patient advocate. If you know folks who have received such services and are interested in sharing their experience, please have them email me or to email a proposal to the email address listed here. Next slide, please. I should say that our next event, our next Bioethics Grand Rounds event, will be on February 8th from noon to 1 o'clock. Our speaker will be Nina Versava, who's at the University of Wisconsin School of Law, talking about the Dobbs decision. So anyone who's interested, keep that on your radar. And with that, I'm going to turn our program over to our first speaker, Liz Worthey, who will be talking about some of the uses of artificial intelligence and informatics in medical practice. Liz?
Thank you very much. Let me move these things out the way and then we can get started. Okay, can you see in presenter mode?
Yes, we can see now, Liz. That's great.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for the introduction. I would say the Halloween parties, we do different themes every year. It's kind of a thing, and gives. We also decorate the outside of the house, so it brings hopefully joy to the folks walking past, or maybe they think we're a little crazy. So as Tom discussed, I'm going to tell you a little bit today about some of the aspects of AI that pertain to application in medicine. And I will say within my group or within the centre, we're applying these sorts of methods in a number of different ways, but I'm not going to go into the specifics of that in any great depth. And we're going to focus more generally on how these methods are applied, and then also some of the ethical issues and concerns that come up from that. So with that, first, there's lots and lots of folks that I work with. I don't do much of this work on my own, and I always run out of time. So I like to try and put this up front. So these are just the groups of individuals who develop the methods, or the people that we collaborate, that we try to use these methods and other computational methods to help patients. So in terms of the data science process, this is a figure that came out, I think, back in maybe 2009, which was really the first widely adopted or used figure describing in a pictorial way the data science process. And there's a number of phases to this process. So obviously the first one is it's data science, it's application of AI, is gathering data from relevant sources. And oftentimes the data is being gathered from many different places. And it's coming from many different data generators using different tools and different machinery. And so the next step is really to scrub the data. More often people are using the term cleansing the data, cleaning the data, which is to make sure that that data is in a format that can be integrated into computational methods. And then the next phase is really ordering and organizing the data, starting to look at the data and look for significant patterns and trends using statistical approaches to really sort of get your head wrapped around what the data is, and maybe more importantly, what the data is not. And then following that with an idea in mind most of the time, but sometimes in a more generic way, constructing models that you can use to answer the questions that you have for that data. And then after that, it is making use of that data within those models in order to generate the knowledge that you're trying to generate. So here it says, putting the results into good use. And this looks very linear, and that's a lie. It's a more iterative process, as we'll come to. But in terms of the data itself, we're going from the target data, process, transform, data patterns, data insights, validated findings, and then utilizable knowledge is the goal. And I mentioned that was a sort of linear view of data science. And of course, it's not normally as clean cut as that. So when we're thinking about the data itself, so in these early phases, we've got training code. We have the training data sets that we're looking at. We're generating candidate models. We then go in to test these models and evaluate them. We have test data, metrics that we derive from that. We have a model that we think is the best. We take that into a production phase. This is the generating results from that production early phase model. Then we're testing it. Is it doing what we think it does? Are we identifying any issues with the data? More tests, more models. This is an iterative process. And then we're deploying it. We're deploying it and giving access to individuals, or users, or stakeholders, or collaborators. And then they are interacting with that model, and they're generating those analyses and insights. And then, of course, there's another phase here, which is to say, what's the feedback from that group of individuals? And then we're monitoring and observing how they interact with it, and also the findings that are generated, and seeing, does it answer the questions that we set out to answer? And oftentimes this is very iterative as well. So it's a complex process. In terms of the applications, so thinking through just some of the applications of AI in healthcare, I just pulled out a few examples. So we have many tools and methods and instruments that are being developed that make use of this approach for monitoring patients. So an example of this that's widely used is elderly fall risk detection. Can you predict when an individual is at greater risk of falling, or that they're moving into that phase where they're much more likely to fall. Onset of heart attack would be another example here. Sometimes these are delivered then as EHR alerts, and sometimes they come through in other ways. There's AI-driven diagnostics, a huge area of development, one that I know well. Most of what I do falls into this category. It's the generation of diagnostic reports that are wholly or partially delivered through application of AI. Rare disease diagnostics, molecular diagnostics. This is the causal variant. Breast cancer subtyping, image analysis to say this is the sort of cancer that we're looking at here. There's also AI-driven treatment plans. So this is a recommender system, which is recommending based on that data process through that model that, for example, this is the right drug combination for this individual, or looking at things that are very complex and that require understanding across large and complex data sets, like, polydrug side effect avoidance. So there's a lot of development in this area. Then there's also AI-driven prognosis. So we know what the diagnosis is, but what does that mean in terms of the long-term outcome for that individual? The disease onset, the survival time, what is likely to happen, what's, for instance, the inpatient length of stay. These are also areas where this method is being applied. And then there's also things like risk stratification. Obviously, these are related, but here we're looking at a report or maybe even alert that comes out that says, this individual is at greater risk for this or at less risk for it. And then another topic that is coming up now, which is a little different from these, but which is still part of healthcare, is, there's a lot of new knowledge that's being generated in healthcare. There's an estimate that over the next year we'll generate as much knowledge as we did in the healthcare field over the last 50 years. And so this is a burden to individuals that practice medicine. And so there are many people who are looking to see whether we can apply these methods to help determine what the healthcare providers should be reading, what they should learn, what they should look at. And so you can see there's many, many different ways that AI is being applied in the field of medicine and healthcare. As I mentioned, a lot of what I do is focused on rare disease, and so a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of how AI is being applied in this area. And this is generally rare genetic disorders, Mendelian disorders. And you can see a lot of it is diagnosis, but we also have prognosis. We have some that would fall more into the category of basic research. And then increasingly, there's a lot of AI being applied in terms of developing or repurposing therapeutics. You can see that many of these studies are large. Some of them are small in terms of the numbers of patients. You can see that in rare disease, it's spanning many different types of rare disease, neurologic, rheumatologic, endocrine, respiratory, across the whole board. And then in terms of the sorts of data that's going into these models, the leader currently is image data, but we also have demographics, omics data, so whole genome sequencing, transcriptomics data, but then we also have a host of clinical data, test results, lab values, patient history, medication, other. And within this other is a variety of patient-provided data that's starting to be brought into these models. And that, as I'll come back to later, introduces its own complexities. And then we talk about AI, but it's not just one single approach. There are multiple different algorithms that get applied within this space, and you can see them here. Ensemble learning is a method that integrates multiple different sorts of models. And so clearly, many people are working on that. So lots of different ways that AI is being applied, even just within rare disease in healthcare. So we think about molecular diagnostics. This is an area that I work on. For an individual with a rare disease, for molecular diagnostics next year, we think about just the cost of the sequencing We hear that maybe it will come down to as little as $250 for a whole genome for the purposes of trying to find the causal variant for a patient with rare disease. But you can see we have still this problem of a huge cost in terms of the interpretation. If we want to be able to diagnose all the people who have rare diseases, then we have to look at this cost. So one of the things that's been done here is to use an ensemble method in order to train the model to identify which variants are most likely to be causing disease, a process that's currently being done by a human in order to make that better, faster, and cheaper. And so this is just an example of the sorts of methods that we're applying here that really say, from this whole genome, these are the causal variants. And you can move to the phase where the human doesn't have to look through hundreds of variants in order to determine, using their insights, which one is most likely to cause disease. Rather, the model can predict a small number of variants that are likely to be associated with the patient's clinical presentation, and then the director can review that. So reducing fatigue, reducing cost, and then also finding variants that would otherwise have been missed. So another example is differentiation of disease subclasses, trying to work out what is different amongst different individuals and using these models to partition large cohorts into people who have distinct disease either in terms of what's causing their disease or distinct responses to drugs, and also trying to work out what the functional impact is of these variants that are being identified. And so this just shows an example of one of the things that we're doing here. So we're using some of those same damage prediction methods, but we're also introducing additional components into that model from protein folding, trying to understand what the impact of a variant is to protein structure and how that relates to their disease. And then also integrating large data sets from the individual, so the individual's transcriptome, looking at what the expression is in that individual patient, looking to see what the metabolomic status is in that individual, and then also integrating all of that clinical data with the overall goal of not just saying this is the diagnosis, but also being able to say individuals who have this constellation of data are more likely to have severe disease, or they're more likely to have heart involvement. And so this is a method that we're using applied to many different disorders, CF, NF, polycystic kidney disease. And then another area, again, within this rare disease space, requires us to do a lot of that same work on the molecular data, but also bring in to the model image data. And this just shows an example from a project that we're working on around glioblastoma. So we're in this project looking to take the slides, the tumor slides from an individual's tumor, and processing it to try and understand what types of cells and how many of which types of cells are present in that sample, either cancerous cells, other types of structures that are in that same tissue or organ, and then integrating that with the molecular data in order to have a much higher level data-driven classification that says this individual has this type of cancer driven by these sorts of molecular variants, and it's this stage, and it has this percentage of infiltrating cells, etc. So again, integrating lots of different types of data modalities so that we can be more accurate in diagnosis, but also prognosis. And then also generating biological insights from this that can be used for clinical decision-making. So in terms of the ethical, so that's some examples of the sorts of ways that we're applying these methods in rare disease. In terms of the ethical, legal, and social considerations for application of AI in medicine, in healthcare, there are many, obviously. There's ethical considerations, there are social considerations, and there are legal considerations. And I just wanted to pull out a few of these that we think about a lot. Think about all of them, but there are some that we think about in particular in the work that I do. So one of them is privacy and security. So these tools ingest lots of different sorts of data: medical notes, test results, medical algorithm outputs, potentially data from mobile devices and other sorts of health sensors. And the data is coming from lots of different places. And some of it is coming from patient devices. And so we have to think about the mass of data that's then being collated in a single place or accessible to a single tool, and the trail that that provides across that individual's life and how that impacts and is important for privacy, and then also security. And one of the things that we know is that when you aggregate that data, you're often pushing to commoditize that data. It's viewed as having value, and that can sometimes change the conversation. And even when it's anonymized, there have been studies that show that you can sometimes trace back to an individual. And that's particularly true in the rare disease space, where you have rare variation and unusual symptoms. And there's lots and lots of different methods that people are working on to try and ensure that the data is secure and to ensure that privacy is collected and is maintained, but this remains a big issue and something we think about a lot. There's also trust and explainability. So often AI till now has been presented as a bit of a black box, and that can make it hard in the clinical setting for patients and providers to understand how a decision was being made. And people often think about that in terms of the patient, but obviously here we're also saying that that is important for the individual that's taking care of that patient. There's been a number of surveys that have been performed, and unsurprisingly, there's a reasonable level of distrust or mistrust often when AI is being used as the system to generate decision-making around healthcare. And so when we're thinking about this, we have to think about making sure we can answer questions like, what data was used in the model and why? Why was it selected? How do you know it's the right data? What features were used and what weights were associated with a particular prediction? And then what are the individual layers and thresholds that were used for a prediction, and how were those decisions made? In some ways, this isn't any different from before, but we have to be careful and make sure that we're still presenting this information along with predictions. Something that's been a matter of lots of discussion recently, and I think is a very important aspect and something we have to continue to focus on, is that application of AI can sometimes generate or amplify existing biases. AI models in different fields have been found to discriminate against women, minorities, other cultures, or ideologies. So a couple of examples: Amazon's HR department, they had to stop using the tool that they were using when they found that it actually favored men over women in terms of who it put forward. There was facial recognition systems that were being used that were AI-based, that were found to be less accurate on individuals with darker skin. An algorithm that was put out there to try and detect signs of Alzheimer's in phone calls in patients in Canada, which would be great as a screening, showed different outcomes with patients who had French accents. So again, it's because a lot of that data and those methods hadn't been carefully thought about in the initial development of that tool. So we have to think about biases and how we're collecting the data. Are we collecting widely? Are we collecting equally, fairly? The data processing, are there any biases that are being introduced at that point? Algorithm development biases, and then biases in how it is being deployed. So all of these biases must be actively searched for and addressed. And then autonomy and control. So these tools are being developed to make increasingly critical and rapid decisions. In a clinical setting, we have to acknowledge that maybe there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Some patients may be more treatment averse. And so we may have to think about how we would tune the tool, the method, for those individuals. And another different group of individuals may be more risk averse, and we have to think about what we can do to make sure that the model takes into account all of those different viewpoints. Traditionally, when we're thinking about autonomy and control, we go to see a doctor, they're giving us information and they're helping us make decisions. So there is some sharing of decision making there. But in that interaction, the doctor tends to provide opportunities for the patient to give feedback, in not all settings, but in many. And sometimes that's based on the relationship that they have with that individual that's been built up over time. In particular, 30 years ago, you got to know someone through all of their healthcare experiences because you were their general practitioner and their go-to person. That's not as much the case anymore. But still, we have to think about how introducing AI into this for all the right purposes needs to take into account ensuring autonomy and control, comprehension, allowing people to make these decisions. I mentioned all of the different ways that AI is being applied. There are diagnostics, population health management as well, therapeutic development, administration and regulation. These are all, critical areas within medicine and within a healthcare system, and they're critical to get right, not just for the patient, but also for the people that are taking care of them, and to make sure that the healthcare system can continue to work and provide care. So liability is a big topic of discussion, obviously. There's debate about who's going to be held liable when autonomous AI decision-making harms patients, which it will at some point. And so the current consensus here is that the professional is open to liability if they're using the tool in a situation outside the scope of its regulatory approval, or if they're misusing it, which has always been the case, or if they're applying it despite having doubts about the validity of the evidence or the predictions from the tool, or with the knowledge of something being obfuscated. And then in other cases, liability is expected to fall back onto the creators and the companies. So a complex topic. In terms of risks and benefits, there's a lot of pros, and then there's a lot of cons or potential cons. The reasons for putting AI into place are often, better, faster, more accurate. On the flip side, on the cons, initially it may lead to increased cost, not in all cases. There's this emotional relationship, particularly in healthcare, that is very important. And then there's also questions about, can we build into AI the principles that we all think is important, ethical principles, and principles in how we want to be treated and the sorts of information we want to know. So again, it comes back to making sure that when we're implementing AI in medicine, we're being intentional in recognizing all of these strengths and weaknesses. And then we also have to be sure that we're not just introducing it in an echo chamber, that we're also doing that with involvement from experts and other individuals from fields outside medicine in computer science, ethics, philosophy, sociology, psychology, and behavioral economics. And then we also need to consider learnings from other fields. Sometimes we think that medicine is something different, harder to introduce new technology into, and in some ways it is, but often, there's a way to do that and learn from other fields. And I think particularly AI in medicine, we need to make sure we're doing that. So just to summarize, I think, the goals are better diagnosis, prognosis, dealing with adverse events, minimizing them, optimizing treatment selections, improved access to therapies, the right combination of therapies, monitoring individuals for disease, and then also, I didn't talk about it, but also work within clinical trials. So these are all great reasons to apply the technology. And then we just need to make sure that we're doing it in the right way. And with that, I will say thank you, and then we'll move to the next speaker.
Thank you, Liz. That was wonderful. Yoav, I will turn the platform over to you if you can bring up your slides.
Great, thank you. Can you see my slides okay? Great, thank you. Pleased to be here. As Tom said, my name is Yoav Schlesinger. I'm an architect of ethical AI practice at Salesforce, and I'm going to take the opportunity this afternoon to dive a little bit deeper on some of the ethical issues that Elizabeth has already given a nod to, in the hopes of enumerating some of the areas of concern that I and others in the ethical AI field have when it comes to big data, data mining, and the application of AI in a healthcare context. And the reason for this conversation at a high level is that despite the many benefits that AI can bring to businesses, society, and to the healthcare industry, there's a general lack of trust in AI systems for good reason. If you look at these headlines and you pay attention, ranging from the impacts of AI in policing and judicial justice recommendations, all the way down to business use cases and the perpetuation of mis and disinformation, AI can play a really integral role in all sorts of aspects of our daily lives. What's not clear is who's liable when AI has a role in a healthcare setting or in big data, data analytics. I come back to this quotation from all of our favorite movie, Jurassic Park, scientist Ian Malcolm saying, you were so preoccupied with whether or not you could that you didn't stop to think if you should. And the central question that I articulate in all of these applications is really that essential question of not just can we do this, but should we? And there's good reason to care about those ethical questions. Gartner estimates that 85% of AI projects will deliver erroneous outcomes due to bias in data, the algorithms, or the teams responsible for managing them. That may not be a huge issue when it comes to the recommendation for a product on Amazon, but certainly in a healthcare context, an erroneous outcome can mean the difference between life and death. And so that harm or potential for harm and the risk associated with it, it gives reason for us to be particularly thoughtful about these applications. And of course, there are others as well that are given a nod here, ranging from the trust we do or don't put in AI systems, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Impending regulation, particularly in the EU with its forthcoming EU AI Act, which will put into place certain compliance mechanisms for high-risk AI systems, many of which Elizabeth described would be classified as high-risk systems under that regime. And then, of course, the essential elements of AI in the first place, AI's scale, the lack of transparency described by Elizabeth in terms of the opaqueness of its decision-making, inferences, and recommendations at times, issues of privacy, accountability, and particularly bias, all of which I'll touch on a little bit further. But first, before doing that, I just wanted to also give a sense of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about big data. And these are oftentimes referred to as the 5 V's. So we have volume, which is just the size of the data, the quantity generated and stored. The variety, so the type and nature of the data, as well as the way of structuring it, text, images, audio, video, that can be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. The velocity, so the time needed to generate and process information. The veracity, meaning data quality and reliability. And lastly, value, the analysis of reliable data, which hopefully adds value within and across the discipline. With those 5 V's in mind, the question is, what is data mining when in its very core? And big data and data mining refers to analytics that can process massive quantities of data, searching for information, including unforeseen information, which can generate unexpected insights. So it's characterized by 2 basic features: the possibility of accessing and using large quantities of data, meeting conditions of at least 3 of those V's, volume, velocity, and variety. And second, the use of data processing techniques that allow for the recognition of previously unidentified patterns. So more pithily, big data is less about data that is big than it is about a capacity to search, aggregate, and cross-reference large data sets. When doing that, then, there are all of these ethical questions that arise, and there are plenty of ethical codes, guidelines, statements of principle, statements of fact that have emerged in this space over the last few years. We at Salesforce have our own set of trusted AI principles that I think are instructive and valuable when it comes to this conversation. And there are 5, notably responsibility, accountability, transparency, empowerment, and inclusion, each of which is an important aspect of thinking about the implications, potential harms, and benefits of data, safeguarding human rights, ensuring fairness, creating actionable explainability, ensuring benefit and non-maleficence, and respecting everyone who's included by the impacts of those AI systems. In other words, ethical data practices equal ethical AI applications. From this report from the University of Toronto, I like this quotation, that the responsible and ethical application of AI technology is closely intertwined with good data practices, such as adequate representation of ethnically diverse populations and maintaining the rights and liberties of those being served. So to some extent, the conversation today is not even necessarily specific to AI applications, machine learning, deep learning, reinforcement learning, on those types of AI applications, as much as it is keyed in on the sources and use of data itself and the ways in which those things need to be addressed. Because the use of that AI, the use of those data, raise ethical issues. And we need to be thinking, therefore, about informed consent, safety and transparency, data privacy, and perhaps most importantly, algorithmic fairness and bias. And I will be touching upon each of these to further explicate what I mean by them. So first, let's talk about informed consent. Unfortunately, in my opinion, big data analytics, data mining, seeking of these patterns and correlations kills the possibility of true informed consent. At an individual level, it kills consent because by its nature, one of the purposes of this type of analytics is to find unexpected patterns in the data. And informed consent requires that at the very least, the person requesting the consent knows what they are asking the subject to consent to. But when it comes to big data and data analytics, it's possible that neither party can actually know what the data may be used to discover. It also potentially undermines the idea of consent at a group level, because when you have this mountain of data about many people, in order to find the correlations between them, you may be finding predictions about individuals who have not contributed to building the model. In other words, even people who haven't consented to having their data used may find that they are just as subject to the model's extrapolations as the people who've contributed data to it in the first place. So in order for meaningful informed consent to actually have impact, we need at least 2 things. We need more fully informed consent so that both the subjects and the investigators can fully understand the stakes and the uses of the data, as well as better means to meta tag the information so that researchers can go back to subjects to see if they consent to secondary uses of that data. When it comes to safety and transparency, the aim should be and is to help policymakers ensure that morally demanding situations raised by AI in healthcare settings are tackled proactively. The limitations of algorithmic transparency is a concern that's dominated most of both the legal and ethical discussions on AI in these cases. But the use and the rise of AI in high-risk situations has increased the requirement for accountable, equitable, and transparent AI design and governance. So the accessibility and comprehensibility of the information are two of the most important aspects of that transparency. We need the capacity to trace culpability back to the maker or operator, which can be threatened by machines or AI or machine learning that can operate by unfixed rules and learn new patterns of behavior, which at the core may threaten both our moral frameworks, those of responsibility, transparency, accountability, et cetera, as well as the core concept of liability. If the extent of the danger is unknown, then the use of machines can limit our ability to assign blame and take ownership over the decision-making of the system. With that, I want to turn to perhaps, for me at least, the most consequential and important area of discussion when it comes to AI in healthcare applications, which is the embedding and of inequality and bias in the data sets and the application and use of those data in making predictions, inferences, and recommendations. Patterns of health inequity permeate these systems and become entrenched, both in the data sets used to train the systems, the data representativeness, and the actual development and implementation lifecycle. So each of these has elements that contributes to the embedded bias and therefore harm to marginalized or historically vulnerable populations by the exclusion of those data in the data sets and the application and choices made in terms of the target variables that the designers of these systems may be using. At the core, all of this is premised on this thing that I like to call datafication, right? The turning of every patient experience into a data point, which essentially requires the reduction, simplification, and coding of experience, which potentially undermines the uniqueness of those experiences. The data has to be pre-processed, meaning that the variables have to be defined so that a system can derive those things from the data. So in other words, it's reducing these complex relations and health narratives of both patients and providers to quantifiable data points. And I believe that by sorting individuals into different groups, according to those standardized categories, shifts the focus from the individual to the group, which means the loss of individual autonomy and the human experience. And as a result, what the essential data choices that are being made may tend to neglect the individual in favor of the group dynamics when it comes to the robustness, diversity, representation of the data in use. AI technologies rely on large data sets, but when biases from existing practices and institutional policies and norms affect those data sets, the algorithmic models they generate will produce inequality. In clinical and public health settings, biased judgments and decision-making and discriminatory healthcare processes, policies, and governance will affect EHR, training curricula, clinical trials, academic studies, public health monitoring records, and more. In clinical decision-making, there are well-established biases against members of marginalized groups, which can enter the clinical notes taken by healthcare workers during and after examination or treatment. So, for example, if these are free text notes that are then used by a natural language processing technology to pick up on symptom profiles or phenotypic characteristics, the real world biases that inform them will be embedded in that natural language processing system. So the risk of discrimination poses special challenges. The use of NLP, for example, to extract diagnostic information from radiology, pathology reports, clinical notes, et cetera. So even in a case where an AI system could be learning from accurate or representative data, there could still be problems because of the underlying biases and inequalities in the system itself. So if, for example, Black patients receive less treatment for pain than white patients, which is acknowledged to be a problem. The AI system, learning from the health records, might learn to suggest that lower doses of painkillers should be prescribed to Black patients, even though that decision reflects systemic bias, and it's not based on biological reality. Furthermore, data representativeness is called into question. So the data sets used to train and validate these models are too often insufficiently representative of the general public. So for example, the data sets that are composed of EHR, genomic databases, and biobanks often undersample those who have irregular or limited access to the healthcare system, like minoritized ethnicities, immigrants, or others. The increased use of digital technologies like smartphones, which Elizabeth was talking about for health monitoring, also create potential for biased data sets because, for example, in the United States, up to 30% of some population subgroups don't own smartphones. So the data sets that rely on mobile technology and social media can underrepresent or exclude those without digital access. Furthermore, the prevalence and incidence of disease and the risk factors vary by population groups. So if data sets don't adequately cover the populations at particular risk, the trained prediction models that are used in these clinical AI systems might have lower sensitivity, which true positive rates for these populations, and therefore underdetect the target condition. In other words, and this is bolded at the bottom because I want to drive this point home, every time a prediction model, which has been tailored to the members of the dominant group, is applied to a disadvantaged group, the model may or is likely to yield suboptimal results for the disadvantaged people that are its targets and its subjects. Finally, I want to talk about the biases actually in the designers and deployers of AI. So the legacies that I've been describing of institutional racism and the implicit biases of AI developers and users might also influence the choices made in the design and deployment of AI. So at the most basic level, the power to undertake these projects is often vested in people with privilege and interests that might exacerbate health inequalities. The sociodemographic composition of people, class, race, sex, age, gender identity, who research and set the agendas for this work don't often reflect the communities which are most affected by the resulting projects. Once that project is underway, choices have to be made about how to define variables and their proxies. And at that stage of the problem formulation, the biases of the designers, developers, and the researchers may allow structural inequalities to be introduced into the model. Then at the stage of extraction, collection, and sort of the wrangling of data, measurement errors and faulty data collection practices could lead to additional discrimination. And then finally, those discriminatory patterns can be passed into design time processes in data pre-processing or the model construction. The decisions about the inclusion or exclusion of personal data, when features like ethnicity are integrated into the models without consideration of the confounding variables there, the models risk identifying as biological characteristics that have socioeconomic or environmental origins. In other words, clinicians who over-rely on AI may take these recommendations at face value, even when the models are faulty, and clinicians who distrust the AI systems, probably with good reason, might discount those recommendations, even if they offer corrections to the discrimination that the provider might otherwise offer. We are stuck in a horrible catch-22 bind when it comes to the biases embedded in healthcare recommendation algorithms. I wish I had a solution for this problem. I'm just enumerating it at this point. In a 2019 study, researchers examined the algorithm developed by Optum. It's an algorithm to predict which patients will need the most care. estimating the needs of 200 million people. But instead of predicting concrete health needs, this algorithm predicted which patients were likely to cost more. The logic underlying that being that sicker people need more care and therefore will be more expensive to treat. But for a variety of reasons, the type of which I have described, including income, access to care, and poor treatment by doctors, Black people spend less on healthcare on average than their white counterparts. So the study authors found that using cost as a proxy measure for health led this algorithm, again, making recommendations for 200 million people annually, to consistently underestimate the health needs of Black people. Instead of reflecting reality, this algorithm was mimicking and further embedding racial bias. I have a handy dandy visual here, which I like to share, that describes all of these sources. Grab a screenshot of that if you would like right at this moment. I find it incredibly useful for describing all of the sources of the data biases that I've been describing. With just a minute or two left, I want to quickly touch on that last ethical issue of personal privacy and data, and then a set of recommendations that I have in this area. So the requirement of these large data sets creates incentives for developers to collect data from many patients, but those patients may be concerned that it could violate their privacy. Because AI can predict private information about those patients, even though the algorithm has never actually received that information, as I described before. So a system might be able to identify that a person has Parkinson's disease based on the trembling of their mouse, for example, even if the person's never revealed that information to anyone or didn't even know themselves. That is a fundamental violation of privacy, especially in the case where that might be provided or sold to a third party. So what can we do about this? I've adapted these recommendations from the World Health Organization quickly. Protect human autonomy. So in the context of healthcare, that means that humans should remain in control of healthcare systems and medical decision-making, that privacy and confidentiality should be protected, and patients must give valid, informed consent for data protection. 2, promote human well-being and safety. Designers of AI technologies should satisfy regulatory requirements for safety, accuracy, and efficacy for well-defined use cases. Measures of quality control and quality improvement in the use of AI must be available to both regulators, patients, and AI creators. 3rd, ensure transparency, explainability, and intelligibility. Transparency requires that sufficient information be published or documented before the design or deployment of an AI technology. That information should be accessible and facilitate meaningful public consultation and debate on how the technology is designed and ways it should and should not be used. 4th, foster responsibility. Although AI technologies perform specific tasks, it's the responsibility of all stakeholders to ensure that they are being used under appropriate conditions and by appropriately trained people. 5th, ensure inclusiveness and equity. Inclusiveness requires that AI for health be designed to encourage equitable use and access, irrespective of age, sex, gender identity, income, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, or other characteristics protected under human rights. And lastly, promote AI that is sustainable and responsive. Designers, developers, and users should continuously assess AI applications during their use to determine whether the AI responds adequately and appropriately to the expectations and requirements of the system. This is all of that in graphic form. So again, if you want, you can take a screenshot. Where are the risks and where are the preventive measures at the clinical, institutional, and societal levels that we can take to ameliorate these risks, minimize harms, and ensure the betterment of health outcomes and society as a result? Because at the end, AI and machine learning have the potential to revolutionize medicine, but only if we consider these issues of big data. And with that, I will stop because I believe we have a few minutes left for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Two extremely interesting presentations today. If anyone has questions, please enter them into the Q&A, and we will get to as many as we can, but we do have a limited number or a limited amount of time. The first question that has come up is one that asks for both of you, how is your work or department integrated into the data mining that's happening? And how often are recommendations and concerns about ethics raised by your team followed? This person asked this in the wake of Twitter laying off their entire ethical AI team. Would either of you like to comment on that?
I think that one's for Yoav. And it's timely. What a good thing to queue you up happening this week with Twitter.
Yes, and last month, actually, Meta, Facebook's parent company, also laid off their entire responsible innovation team. So I'm going to hold tight to my chair in the hopes that Salesforce will continue my employment. We actually sit, the Office of Ethical and Humane Technology at Salesforce sits within the product organization. So we are an integrated part of the product development and deployment lifecycle, which means that we interface in a cross-functional way with all of the data scientists, engineers, designers, product managers who create our AI products. Each of those undergoes a legal and ethical review before they can be deployed to our customers. We don't have an ability yet to pull the end-on cord and stop a product launch, but our recommendations are generally enforced by our legal partners. So we have the benefit of having good friends in our product council who are able to ensure that our recommendations are embedded in the product development specs for each of our products. So it is a difficult process of balancing pros and cons, risks and benefits, business needs and ethical requirements. Doing the work of ethics in the enterprise is not always strictly what is good and what is bad, but also conversations about how much good and how much bad in order to weigh those relative aspects of both the needs of the business, customers, and society. And I get to sit at the interesting nexus of that conversation.
It does make me, yeah, I was just going to comment on, or maybe get Yoav's take on it. With all of this stuff happening, people have been talking about it a lot. And so there are other industries where the body who is regulating it, or the watchdog, sits outside the industry. I would guess, I'm not an expert, it's unusual to have a whole department within the organization that performs that task. And to be clear, I think that's critical for AI and data mining. But I wonder if this is going to be the nudge, the big nudge that makes a number of these industries come under the lens a bit more from some external regulatory organization. What do you think?
Yes, I mean, the EU has always led in this regard. GDPR kind of revolutionized the way tech companies and everyone else handled data. I think that the emergent EU AI Act will do the same thing for AI in creating whole departments or functions within companies that are responsible for thinking about, reporting on, creating transparency and compliance around the use of AI in high, medium, and low risk contexts. So we're probably at the stage of development of ethical AI practices in the enterprise, mirroring, security practices in the 1980s, when it was kind of like, oh, there's a problem here, but we're not ready to address it entirely with huge teams that are tasked with doing that right now. And over the last 40 years, we've seen obviously an incredible development of that function in tech companies, to the point where the idea of not penetration testing or red teaming a product is completely anathema. And I think we will, in short order, be there when it comes to AI products as well.
I think we have time for one more question. I think this one's more directed toward you, Liz. The question is, medical practitioners generally accept that treatment is not always successful. When care is directed by AI, how do we know if an adverse outcome is the fault of AI or is just within the range of expected outcomes? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I guess the glib answer would be sometimes we don't, but the better answer would be that sometimes you can define what is possible on both sides. So, what are the parameters around the tool? What was in place before that technology was brought in? But there's going to be cases where it's unclear because, I used to wonder the term practice of medicine when I was young. I was like, well, it's a very interesting term to use. But the more that I've been within healthcare, I come to better understand that it is an individual's judgment based on the knowledge that they have at hand and the models and predictions that they use, have been taught, can access. And so I think, this comes into that. And in some ways it won't change some of those ways of doing things. But to all of the things that you have talked about, we can certainly try and define exactly when that's likely to get so close that you can't differentiate. And then you can start looking really hard at those areas and say, well, what can we do to sort of work this out? You don't want to leave people in the lurch. Otherwise, to Yoav's point, they won't want to use the tool, even if it is the tool that makes their life easier and saves money and saves patients.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'm going to have to cut off our questions for at this time there. I want to thank both of our speakers. This was an extremely interesting bioethics grand round session, and I think I learned a lot, and I hope the rest of our attendees did as well. So thank you very much, and we will see you all at our next bioethics grand rounds. Thank you.